Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to the talk today. Since we are a rather intimate group, I think we'll have ample time for questions, and hopefully I'll be able to rise to the occasion and answer all of them, or at least give some indication of where the answer may be if I don't know it. I wanted to say, before it slips away from me, because this is important, the title of my talk I took from a quote from the Cheyenne chief Red Wolf, who was a chief that probably most of you have not heard of. But the very first group of students who came to Haskell Institute, 22 of them in the fall of 1884, a number of them were Cheyennes. And it was important for the elders of the tribe, as well as parents, to know what was happening with their children when they're away from home at this new institute that the government had set up for them. And Red Wolf, among several others, Split Axe and some other Cheyenne elders and chiefs, visited in 1888 and wanted to see what was going on at the school. And one of the things that he said to the superintendent of the school at the time, who was Charles Robinson, some of you may know, also the first governor of the state of Kansas, was to teach my people in the right way. And the entire quote is, teach my people in the right way, do not abuse them. And it's a commentary, I think, on, well, several things. For one, the difference in traditional forms of education, which was a holistic kind of upbringing, and where discipline, physical discipline certainly, would never have been a part of that upbringing. It's also a comment, I think, on some of the contradictions about Haskell. Contradictions that maybe to some extent continue to this day. I got to thinking about the idea of contradictions, and a quote occurred to me. I have a background once upon a time, and one that I still like to foster in English literature. And T.S. Eliot has this nice quote that's often stuck with me. He says, between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, lies the shadow. And in that shadow between thinking about something and actually executing it is a lot of room for contradiction. And so here's a nice postcard that I didn't pay for, and that's why it still has the website on there, the little piece of clip art. But it's a nice picture postcard of Haskell Institute, probably in its infancy, in its very early years. And this picture is good for thinking about contradiction as well. On the one hand, you have this kind of welcoming archway, and then within, you have what turns out to be a rather cold, institutional kind of environment. So I thought it was a great way to begin in thinking about this. And before I go any further, I do want to reel back for just a moment and again thank everyone that's involved with this conference. Thank the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for their support and their sponsorship, also the Department of Anthropology, and last but certainly not least, the graduate students who have worked so diligently and so hard to put this together, and in particular Jennifer Bang, who introduced me, and Anna Weiser and Diane Eady. So a lot of kudos and thanks to them ought to be extended. So I wanted to start with some background information on Haskell and give you a little bit of a history of the school, how it came to be. I think this is important because it's an area that, although it has been explored more in depth, certainly in the last 20 years, perhaps than ever, it's still a kind of an area of Indian-white relations that are not very generally understood. And it also, I think, helps to set the stage, for what happened at Haskell and to connect to the themes of this conference. So if we're thinking about the 19th century and the time when the United States is moving from kind of its founding, or its early national period, really, I guess would be a better way to put it, into something of a more recognizable, if not yet formidable, world power. The 19th century is a time of great contradiction as well in terms of Indian policy, federal Indian policy specifically. If you were able to transport yourself back to the 19th century and talk to someone, non-Indian someone, no matter where they fell on the spectrum of their conception about what Native Americans represented for either the present or the future of the country, I think you would hear a familiar refrain. You would hear the idea of an Indian problem being espoused or being referred to. And so, again, no matter where someone fell in terms of thinking about Indians, that's really how they conceived of it, generally speaking. So what would be the solution to that? And it's a contradictory period because you have both some of the most intense warfare that was ever fought between natives and non-native peoples on the one hand, and on the other you have a lot of really quite admirable humanitarian kinds of efforts at reform to go another way with policy. Now, that being said, when we look back at what I just termed as humanitarian reform from the perspective of today, it may look pretty bad to us. It may look pretty awful. But in fact, that is what it was. So I want to fast forward then a little bit to the latter part of the 19th century, post-Civil War. The reservation system by this time is where most Indians find themselves. There are a few who are not, but for the most part, Indians have been removed through one means or another, through removal acts of legislation, through warfare, or other designs. And in the 1870s, the president is Ulysses S. Grant, the great hero of the Civil War, at least from the perspective of the winning side. Grant enacts, probably because he is a soldier, something that soldiers often do, a peace policy. He's tired of fighting and sees the folly and the destruction in it. So he tries to inaugurate something very different and to bring an end to warfare with Indians. So he's falling more on the side of reform, I think, than war. And he inaugurates this peace policy, but it's probably best known as being a grand failure. It's a failure for a whole lot of reasons, and I'm not going to go into all of those. But for one thing, I think almost everyone has probably heard of and can more or less pinpoint the time frame of the Custer fight at the Little Bighorn, 1876. So obviously that rubs against the grain of the idea of a peace policy, and there are many other wars and similar events in that period. In 1879, a former Army captain, Richard Henry Pratt, also a Civil War veteran, is allowed to start up a school for Native Americans. Particularly, he wants to focus on Native American children. This comes out of an experience he has of guarding prisoners from prisoners of war, from fights between the United States and various Indian tribes, particularly the Cheyenne. And Pratt is a reformer, but his idea of reform and the way that he couches that idea are somewhat the flip side of the old adage, the only good Indian is a dead one. What Pratt has to say is that Indians themselves are human beings. That's something of a radical idea for a lot of people. But there's nothing to be valued in their cultures. There's nothing to be prized in what makes them Indian. And so his motto, his kind of creed is kill the Indian and save the man. And that very much guides his policy and his work at the Carlisle School that he establishes at a former military barracks in Pennsylvania in 1879. And Pratt and Carlisle become the model for what will very soon become federal policy. Within a few years, the government has taken a look at what Pratt has done and have, as the United States government often does, jumped with both feet into a new policy direction without really seeing where it's going to go. And they get behind it with full force of federal power. So Haskell, along with a few other schools, are opened in the 1880s. 22 students at the beginning. By 1900, there are 500 or more students. This map shows really the entire government Indian school system. And you can see there are a lot of little dots and place names on there. I know it's not the best in terms of reading clarity, but if you look in the state of Kansas, you'll see Haskell there. And Haskell has a big star next to it because Haskell represents, along with the others on this map that have the stars, sort of the elite tier of these schools. So while this map as a whole shows things like day schools, which are located generally on or near reservations where Indian children go to school, funded by the federal government, reservation boarding schools that are on or near reservations, where Indian children go and stay, generally for the week, maybe get to come home on the weekends, in some cases throughout the year, except for certain times. Haskell, Carlisle, Chilocco in Oklahoma, Chamawa in Oregon, Sherman Institute in California, etc. About 25 of these schools represent the top shelf, non-reservation Indian boarding school, where children are actually removed from their home environments, brought to some place far away from everything that is familiar to them, and exposed to a re-education experience that is itself holistic, but holistic in a completely different kind of way than traditional education would have been. It's the thinking, along with that kill the Indian, save the man ideology, is by putting the children in an environment where they can be civilized from the ground up, they will see all the benefits of Western modes of thinking and will want to become citizens. And this is of a piece really with the Dawes Act and other attempts to change Indian cultures from the ground up or from the inside, but we don't have time to talk about Dawes and others today. This is a shot of Haskell that is interesting because I walk by this building quite a bit. It's still there. It's one of the few buildings on campus that is still around from the very early period. Hiawatha Hall is what it's called, and it is a kind of a grand old building. It's, I'm sorry to say, in not such a good state of repair today, but that's something that the campus is actively trying to change. Another shot of the Haskell campus, this one looking south. So I would say if you were standing at about 23rd and Barker, approximately today, looking south over 23rd Street, this is what you would have seen in about 1884. And you have to realize this is rather isolated from the general community at large at that time. It's not all that close to Lawrence. In fact, they have their own rail spur on the campus to bring in supplies and so forth. This is a panoramic shot, but I had to split it in two. I think it's a kind of nice picture, and I just wanted to orient you to what the place looked like at the time. So when we had our brown bag lunch yesterday, one of the points that I was trying to get across is that while I often speak about Haskell, I've been thinking about it for a long, long time, being part of this conference forced me to think about it in some different ways. Some ways that were very appropriate, in fact, to think about it, but that I hadn't really conceived of in exactly that form. And one of them is migration, and certainly you have patterns of migration. Because if you have a school that starts out in 1884 with 22 students, and by 1900 you have 500 or more, and in another 10 years it will be bigger than Carlisle at about 1,200 students. You know, how are students getting here? What makes them come? What things push them to Haskell specifically, or push them away from home perhaps and pull them specifically to Haskell? And there are a lot of answers for that.